Welcome back to the Big Dream Comics podcast. If you're new, thanks for checking us out. If you're returning, we appreciate your support. I'm your host, and with me is Snypehunter, lead writer and artist for Big Dream Comics. Hello, everyone. Last time we talked about comic books that were influential to you. Today we would like to focus on some of the writers and artists. Well, everyone has already heard plenty about the famous creators like Stan Lee, Siegel and Schuster, Kane and Finger, Steve Ditko, Chris Claremont, Frank Miller, Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, Jim Kirkman, the Kuberts, the Ramitas, and so on. I would like to spotlight some of the lesser known creators. Great! Who would you like to start with? Well, first of all, while Stan Lee gets so much credit for Marvel Comics, and rightly so, Jack Kirby created a whole lot of the looks and stories behind some of your favorite Marvel and DC characters. I'd like to talk a little more about Larry Hama, since he worked on many of the books I collected. Among others, he wrote for G.I. Joe, The Nom, Nth Man, and Wolverine. I learned a lot of military lingo from him that he sprinkled in from his own service experiences. His comics didn't treat the readers as kids, although the comic was meant to encourage kids to buy toys. I also learned a lot about Japanese culture, which, before the explosion of manga and anime, wasn't very prevalent in comics. Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes were ninjas, while Wolverine kind of saw himself as a samurai and fell in love with a woman named Mariko Yashida and wanted to marry her. Some of the artists I liked on G.I. Joe were Herb Trimp, M.D. Bright, and Andrew Wildman, among others. I really liked how they made the G.I. Joe weapons and vehicles look realistic, and the Cobra vehicles and uniforms were kind of fantastic, but they were still seemingly could exist in the real world. Who else would you like to talk about? One of my favorite artists is Arthur Adams. He's really famous for doing X Men, uh, run on the Fantastic Four, where Wolverine and the Hulk and Spider Man and Ghost Rider took over for a couple issues against the Mole Man. Longshot's introduction, and a lot of trading cards. I think he's the definitive artist for Longshot, and he draws some of the best Shadowcat and Dazzler I've ever seen. And certainly his work on the X Babies and I believe Excalibur are pretty famous. What I really like about him is he kind of has a way of making the women look cute without overly, how we say, making them cheesecake. And his monsters are really detailed, but they also have kind of a cute factor to them. Were there any creative teams that you would like to talk about? Sure. I collected the first series of the New Warriors from the beginning, and they were created by Tom DeFalco and Ron Friends, with a lot of art by Mark Bagley and Derek Robertson. It was a new team of relatively young, not well known characters like Nova, Firestar, Speedball, and Namorita, Marvel Boy, Night Thrasher, and it was significant for me because I wasn't around for the beginning of teams like the Avengers or Justice League, where they took a bunch of individual heroes and brought them together. So this was kind of like my generation's Avengers or Justice League, and I really enjoyed how they had to go through the training of working together when most of them were heroes on their own and gone through growing pains working as a team and getting to know each other and trusting each other. So I really enjoyed that run for a long time. I'd like to speak a little more about Mark Bagley along with New Warriors. He's very prolific on Spider Man, Venom, and Ultimate Spider Man. What I really like about him is just very clean, consistent work. His body proportions were always realistic. There weren't any really weird panels that took you out of the story. He was really good when there were a large number of characters on the page, and he was just a workhorse. When he was on a run, you knew that his art was going to be there issue after issue, and there weren't going to be any issues in between that had a filler artist because he couldn't meet the deadlines. So when I think of just a pro's pro in the comics business, I really think of Mark Bagley. The New Warriors was written by a guy called Fabian Nicieza, who also worked on X Force and X Men, and I think he just really did a great job on team books, giving each member of the team something to do, some dialogue, and not just focusing on the most popular characters and leaving the other members out. I understand you also wanted to say a little more about some of the comics that you mentioned last episode. Yeah, like Fables by Bill Willingham and Mark Buckingham. It's a story about like fairy tale characters like the Big Bad Wolf, Pinocchio, existing in the modern day. It was a combination of serious but also whimsical at times because we are dealing with fairy tale characters, but there are issues that they could actually die and were in danger. So it was just a great combination how they did it, and the artwork. Some of the characters were more realistic, while some of the others, like the Wind Wolves, were a little more
whimsical. And then this was before the TV show Once Upon a Time, and of course, other people have tried to adapt fairy tales to the modern world, but I just think the Fable series, for how long they did it and surprising the audience on whether the new characters would be heroes or villains, was just very well done. I mentioned Bone from Jeff Smith, who's a cartoonist, so his art style was, very exaggerated, and it kind of would look like a comedy, and it did have hilarious comedic elements to it, but it also had elements of horror with creatures that had very bad intent for our heroes. And I just feel like the way he drew his work didn't take away from the more serious issues he was dealing with, which was very inspirational to me since my work tends to be a little more cartoony than realistic, also. A name that is really familiar to the manga and anime community is Rumiko Takahashi, who wrote and drew Inuyasha and Yashahime. Um, it Her name may not be as familiar to people on the comic side, but her work has a feel of combining the monster of the week plus an overarching longer story, and she also was able to create a lot of kind of bipedal animal characters, which is something that I've tried to emulate a little, and she just did a really good job exploring feudal Japanese culture while also kind of borrowing from a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court by having a young girl from the modern day being transported to the fantastical feudal era. The last creator that I'd like to talk about today is Sana Takeda, who works with Marjorie Liu on several works, including a book called Monstrous. And I just think she's doing some of the most beautiful art today. Again, there's a lot of animal hybrids, bipedal animals, whatever you want to call it. And she's also doing a lot of awesome fantasy characters and long flowing medieval robes and armor, and she has a kind of painting style that just makes pretty much every panel a piece of art that could be framed. So I think she's just one of the best artists working today.
That's all we have for today. Thanks to Snypehunter, and thank you for listening. See you next time.